Hello and welcome to lesson 1 of week 3. In this lesson, we are going to look at different CSS properties that we use to create containers on the web page and set the style and the design for the container. And then we are going to go on to look at how we set this property for responsiveness and for better layout of our web page across different devices. My name is Mildred. We are going to first of all look at how we can set the height and the width property for an element. We are going to start backwards so that you see that sometimes we need to set certain properties before we set other properties. We have our HTML page that has a heading with the h1 tag, and we have this container with the div tag. This container here, we want to place something in it. Maybe I will put a text here to say this is container 1, just for us to know where the container is, and then I'll close the paragraph, and then I'll put something in the container here, and I'll say this is container 2. So we have a page, container 1, container 2, but we can't see a visible container, and we want to work on that. In CSS, the first thing we want to set is the height and the width of the element. Now we use a div tag. We can use an HTML element selector div and apply this to all of the div tags, or we can just create a style for the first container and let this style be container 1. We have it with the class selector. So now that we have the container 1, we want to set the properties that we can apply using the class attributes on the first container. So we want to set the height of this container to be 500 pixels, and we want to set the width of the container to be, let's say, 350 pixels. Now when we refresh our page, nothing is going to happen in terms of seeing a container on the page, and the reason is, while we have the height and the width, it's not visible because we have no borders for this container. We have not also applied this style to the HTML page. So here I can come here to say class is equal to container 1. Okay, if you are not taking the HTML course, which is required before you take the CSS, this will be a little difficult for you. Alright, so class is equal to container 1, and when we refresh our page this time, we'll not see anything apply here because nothing is there. We'll do the same thing for container 2. So let's use the class selector and we'll say container 2, and maybe we want to have the same style. And so because we want the same style, you can actually apply this style on the container 2 by coming here to say class equal to container 2. So we'll use different styles just for us to illustrate different things as we go along. Okay, so we'll use container 1 for now for the first illustration. So for this container 2, I'll leave this out for now, and then we'll create it later. But we'll see that we can't see the second container yet because this one we set the height and the width of the container, but there is no border. So now from the first place where this is applied, it stops everything from printing out after it until we fix it properly and do what we are supposed to do. This introduces us to the border property. But before that, I want you to see something about the width property. When you set this property width and you put a value, even when your screen size is smaller than this value, you now have horizontal scroll bar. So if you want it to be responsive, you use something we call the max width property, which says this is the maximum width it can have, and so it adjusts on the page and resizes based on your screen size or how much of your browser window is open. Now for the border property, we have a shorthand border written like this. When we use the shorthand border property, we use it to specify both the style, the width, and the color of the line that will surround that element, which is like the container we want to create. So when we say we want, the first thing we must have is the border width, and so we use any length unit of measurements. Then we want to put the border style. Let's say we want dashed lines, right? And then we want to put the border color. Let's say we want a red border. So this is a shorthand property. Now this is going to apply to all 4 sides for the height and the width that we set. We can see everything here because now we have a border, so the height that we set and the width that we set is visible. In week 4, we are going to look at the display property where we can put these containers side by side, but for now it's like this, and this is because of the default display of the elements that we are using. We're going to look in details about display in week 4's lessons, but for now we have that applied. So now we have this border, we see the height and the width. We can reduce the height to 250 so that we can see everything clearly on the page without scrolling, and maybe we'll put the width to be 300 like that. And so when we refresh, we have it smaller based on the height and width we set. This property border is shorthand for several properties. We don't want this to apply to all 4 sides, right? Maybe we want to set the style separately for each of the 4 corners. Like we see this container has this. Maybe we want here to be solid, here to be dashed, like different styles. But we'll use this to illustrate. We're not trying to build any beautiful design, just to show you the properties and the value that they can take. Now this border property is a shorthand for border top. Now you set the top of the border. So when we say we want the border top to be only this style applied to just the top of the border, and we refresh, we'll get only one line at the top of the border. You can set a different style and say you want another value for border right. Right, so we say border right, we want border right to be maybe 5 pixels, we want the line to be maybe a solid line, and we want the color to be blue or something like that. And then you see that the right border appears, it has a different thickness. So when we put that value of 5 pixels, it affects the thickness, and then the line is a solid line we want. Okay, we have other values for the type of line or the style that we want. We can do the same thing and say we want the border bottom and we want the border left. So maybe we say we want the border bottom to be 2 pixels and to be green, and we want the border left to be 5 pixels, and maybe we want it to be yellow. Okay, so you can use any of the color values, whether the color name, the hexadecimal value, the RGB value, anything you want for your design. And so we have different border styles for the different sides here. So that is how we specify individual border for individual sides. Now this is still a shorthand. Even when we're doing the individual, we can actually have the individual border properties to specify the thickness of the line, the style of the line, the color. So we want to have another property that we look at, the border style. So we now do just the style of the border without specifying anything else. So let's say we want to have a groove style for the border. This groove will apply to all 4 sides of the border. We don't have a color, so it will set the default. Just give us a groove border there, and we can see. This border style is also a shorthand where you can have border top style to have individual side style. Right, and then you want to have border right style, and then you have a different style, and then you can have border left style, and you can have a different style for the left, and then border bottom style, and then let's give a different style here. When we refresh, we'll see that we just did the same thing but use different values to specify individual styles for each of the different. So when you specify things like this and it is something that you want the same style for all sides, you can just use the border style property instead of the individual border top style. You use this just in the event that you have specific requirements or design requirements and you want to focus on just one side, right? So that's for the border top. So I'm going to revert this to be the border style. Okay, so I'll make the border style to be let's say, now we have another property we call the border width, written like this, border width. Now the border width is what we use to set the thickness, the line, and we use any length unit of measurements to specify the values. You can have 1 to 4 values for the border width. So you can say border width equal to 5 pixels. And so when we have this style, the thickness now of the border is going to be set based on the thickness that we specify, and it's going to apply to all sides because we just use one value. So whenever you have one value, it applies to all 4 sides or whatever CSS property you're using. If it takes 1 to 4 values, the first value, if it's one value, applies to all sides. If you have 2 values here, 10 pixels, what happens is that the first value applies to the top and bottom, and the second value applies to the left and the right. So when I refresh, you'll see the left and the right will have more thickness than top and bottom because the 5 pixel is top and bottom, 10 pixel is left and right. When you have 3 values like this, let's say another one 15 pixels. When you have 3 values, then you can say the first one applies to the top. This will be for the top. The middle one here, the second, will apply to the left and the right, and then the third value applies to the bottom. And so when we save this and we refresh, we have it just as we specified there. So for any CSS property that you have that can take 1 to 4 values, it's the same pattern. If you take 4 values here, 20 pixels, it's going to be like top, right, bottom, left. Okay, so it always goes in that order: top, right, bottom, left. So we'll see top will be thinner, then right will be the next thinnest, left will be larger, then the bottom will be the next largest, then the right, then the top. So top will be the smallest in thickness when we see it. So we'll see left, then bottom, the right, then top. when you have 4 values. So any CSS property that you have, not just the border property, that you have 1 to 4 values, when it's 1 value, it applies to all sides. When it's 2 values, the first is for top and bottom, the second is for left and right. When it's 3 value, the first is for top, the second one for left and right, the last is for bottom. And when it's 4 values, it's top, right, bottom, left. Okay, so take note of that. So you can take 1 to 4 values. You can use the border width this way if you want to specify the width for the different sides. Then apart from the length unit of measurements, there are predefined values, like if you want to say thick, medium, and those values. So you have thin, medium, thick that you can use. So we can say thick like this, and it applies to all sides. So that is for the border width property. We can have next the border color property. So everything we did in the shorthand, we can do it with their individual properties: the style, the width, and the color. And let's say we set a color for the border. So this is going to apply to all sides because we use 1 value. You can set the color for the different sides to say, I want a value for top and bottom, I want a different value for left and right, like that. So when you do this like this and you refresh, that is what is going to happen. Okay, so you apply the same principle of 1 to 4 values where each value applies to. Now we have something we call the border radius property, and we use this to have a rounded corner. We can see that we have the edge squared like this, but we can have rounded corner using the border radius property. We can set the border radius like this, and then we specify the unit or the number we want the thickness or how curved it will be. So let's say we specify 25 pixels. You can use the length unit of measurement for this also, and then we see that it's curved like that. You can have different values for the different sides for your border radius. So when we have 25 pixels, 50 pixels, the same pattern applies of where each value applies to when you have more than 1 value. So you can see the left and the bottom here, it has the first value applied, and the right, the bottom left and the top right have the same value, while the top left and the bottom right have the same values applied when you have 2. So you play around with this and take note of how this plays out when you use them. Refer to your lesson resource to see all of the individual property style when we use all of this. So you can go ahead and use just a border shorthand property to specify everything. So we can just say border, you must specify the thickness first, which is 5 pixels. We want the style, and then we want the color, and let's say we want 1 color for it. So let's say aqua, like that, and then we can leave the border radius there. So we have this style for our container. So you can see how we use that property. You can see that when this text in the container started, it is just on the border like this. In the next lesson, we are going to look at the margin and the padding property that we use to handle things like this. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.